I remember the silence arriving. Before, I was in a sterile briefing room in Geneva, interpreting the slow, measured cascade of collapsing information. Generals with stars on their collars were staring at screens that had gone blank. The feeds from New York, then London, then Tokyo just stopped. First, the audio would cut out, replaced by a high carrier tone that made your teeth ache, and then the video would freeze on a face twisted in a scream or a room filled with panicked motion. Then nothing. The world wasn't ending with a bang. It was ending with a click, a severance, a finality that left only a quiet electronic tone in its place. One of the generals, a man whose face was a map of old wars, had leaned forward and whispered, "What is that sound?" And I, the interpreter, had nothing to translate. It was the sound of everything going away. It was the sound that came before the silence. That memory is why I trust the hum of our generator and the clean green lines of the diagnostic screen more than anything else in this world. I finished my sweep of the perimeter sensors, watching the little icons on the monitor blink their confirmation. Fence integrity was 100%. Seismic detectors were active and calibrated. All systems were green. My gaze drifted to the monitor in the top left corner, the one labeled MAYA. She was in her room, curled in a chair with a book, her face illuminated by a single reading lamp. Her hands were still, resting on the pages. She was safe. She was contained. I reached out and adjusted the gain on the audio sensor for her sector, a sensitive microphone that could pick up the sound of a falling pin. A brief squeal of static shot through my headphones and I flinched, my hand recoiling from the dial. The noise was an intrusion, a violation of the perfect, controlled quiet I had built for us. I took a breath and ran the full system diagnostic again, my eyes scanning the lines of code for any error, any variable I had not accounted for. As the final check completed, a new alert flashed in the corner of my main screen. It was a small box of red text, stark against the placid green. Proximity. Proximity. Alert. Unknown. Biological. 2 plates, 2 forks, 2 perfectly measured portions of canned beans and peaches. Every meal was the same, a routine that left no room for surprise. Maya looked up from her food, her fork resting on the side of her plate. "I saw birds today. They can go anywhere they want." Her signs were small and tired. I didn't look up from my own meal. "They can also be eaten." She put her fork down with a soft click against the ceramic. Her eyes were fixed on me, and when she signed again, her hands moved with a sharp, deliberate force that cut through the quiet air. "This isn't safety. A cage is still a cage." The words landed like stones. I felt a familiar coldness spread through my chest, the ghost of an audience watching me fail. I was her father. My only job was to protect her. I stood and took her plate, ignoring the accusation in her eyes. I turned to the sink, and as my back was to her, I felt more than saw her final words, signed with a chilling resolve that I did not understand until later. "You're not the only one who can keep secrets." Our supplies were low, so a scavenging run was necessary. I spent the morning planning it, mapping a route that was efficient and exposed us for the shortest possible time. The journey was tense, the silence of the world outside our walls, a heavy blanket. I found what I was looking for in a small town at the base of the mountain, but on the way back, I saw a wrecked military transport pushed into a ditch. Against my better judgment, I stopped. Inside, a shattered tablet still held a faint charge. A single file was open, mostly corrupted, but I could make out fragments of the text. Chimera test log 7. Below that, unforeseen semiotic recursion, Warden Cole reporting containment failure. The words meant little, but they sparked a different memory, hot and sharp. I was on a podium in a different life, the lights burning my face. A hostile delegate from a small nation was signing, his hands a blur of aggression. He used a regional variant, an obscure dialect I had only read about. My pride, my reputation for flawless precision, would not let me ask for clarification. I made the call, a split-second interpretation of a direct threat. I saw the horror dawn on my own face, reflected in the security monitors, as my words sent armed guards swarming the stage and a diplomatic summit into chaos. The memory left me sweating and breathless in the driver's seat of the truck. When I returned, Maya was on the small observation deck we had built, staring out at the perimeter fence. I knew she went out there sometimes, exploring the edge of her cage. Through the control room monitors, I watched her. She was looking at the trees, at the quiet spaces between them. I switched to a camera on the fence line and zoomed in. A small group of them, the Murmurs, were moving through the forest. They shambled with a clumsy gait, but there was a strange synchronicity to their movements, an unsettling coordination. Then one of them stopped. It lifted its head, a slow, unnatural motion, and turned. It seemed to look directly at the relay station, directly at the spot where my daughter stood. That night, my own unease kept me in the control room long after Maya should have been asleep. I saw her on the monitor for the observation deck, a small silhouette against the stars. She was holding my long-range binoculars, pointed out at the dark horizon. I watched her for a moment, then switched the main screen to the high-powered camera, aiming it in the same direction. Miles away, a single point of brilliant red light bloomed in the night. It arced up, a perfect, desperate curve, then vanished. A flare. The first sign of another living person in almost a year. A knot of hope and terror tightened in my stomach. Then I saw what she must have seen next. Below where the flare had been, a scattered constellation of smaller, fainter lights began to move on the ground, converging on that single spot. The survivor was not alone. They were being hunted. Maya burst into the control room, her face pale, her hands flying. "We have to help them." I shook my head, my own hands forming the signs slowly, deliberately. "No, it's too dangerous, but they'll die. We have to do something. My only job is to protect you." Her face crumpled, the hope replaced by a familiar, bitter anger. She stepped closer, her signs so sharp they felt like blows. "You're not protecting me. You're hiding. You're still that same coward, the one who fell apart on that stage when everyone was watching." The accusation struck home, precise and cruel. I had no defense against it because it was true. I turned away from her, breaking the conversation, and stared at the monitors. The red alert from Sector 7 was still blinking. I heard her turn and leave the room, the soft padding of her footsteps a sound of retreat. I thought the argument was over. I thought I had won. I woke before dawn with a feeling of profound wrongness. The air in the station was still and cold. I went to her room. The bed was empty, the sheets thrown back. On her pillow was a single sheet of paper with 3 words written on it. "Someone has to." Panic seized me, cold and absolute. All my protocols, my routines, my carefully constructed walls of safety, they all dissolved into nothing. I grabbed the rifle from its locker, stuffed supplies into a pack, and ran out into the gray, pre-dawn light, following the faint track she had left in the dirt. I found her near the flare's origin point, hiding in a shallow ravine. She was with a man, his clothes torn and filthy, his body shaking with exhaustion. And they were not alone. A pack of Murmurs was closing in on them, moving with that unnerving, silent purpose. We fought our way out, a chaotic scramble of fear and adrenaline. We made it back to the station, and I slammed the heavy gate shut, the sound of the locking mechanism echoing in the sudden safety. I slumped against the cold steel, my body trembling with relief. The man, Garrett, leaned against the wall, breathing in ragged gasps. He looked past me, his eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with our escape. He was staring at the seismic sensor display on the wall, at the dozens of red icons that were now swarming the outside of our fence. "They followed us," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "All of them." We got him back to the station, and I patched the gash on his arm, a long, shallow tear that was bleeding enough to be a problem, but not deep enough to be a death sentence. He called himself Garrett, and he was a biologist of some kind, a fact that made my skin crawl, because it meant he was smart enough to be a different kind of dangerous. After he drank some water, he fell asleep on one of the spare cots, and I went back to the control room to watch the perimeter, my entire body tight with the new risk I had allowed inside. Maya stayed with him, and I watched them on the monitor, a knot forming in my gut as she brought him a fresh canteen of water when he woke. He didn't treat her like a child or a fragile thing. Instead, he leaned forward and asked her questions, his hands moving in the clumsy way of someone who didn't know the language but was trying. I couldn't hear their conversation through the silent feed, but I could see her responding, her signs sharp and clear, her face animated in a way I hadn't seen in months. Later, Garrett found me while I was cleaning our weapons, the scent of solvent sharp in the cold air of the maintenance bay. He stood there for a moment, just watching my precise movements as I oiled the rifle's bolt. She has a unique gift. I didn't look up, just kept working the cloth over the metal. She's observant. "No, you don't understand," he said, and his voice was low, intense. "I've seen a mind like hers before, in the lab. It didn't end well." I finally stopped and looked at him, at his thin frame and the haunted look in his eyes. He seemed like a man running from something more than just the dead. I scoffed and turned back to my work, because his words felt like a threat to the sterile order I had built. His warning was just another variable I could not control, so I chose to ignore it. The next day he was relentless, following me to the control room and insisting I look at something on the small, rugged tablet he'd kept in his pack. He said the Murmurs were communicating, and I told him he was seeing patterns in chaos because his mind was addled from exhaustion. He turned to Maya, who was watching us, and beckoned her over. He showed her the tablet, and my anger flared, a hot protective fire, because he was pulling her into his delusion. I walked over, ready to put an end to it, and saw the grainy video playing on the screen. It was old footage from a clean, white laboratory. A single Murmur was strapped to a chair, wires attached to its head while scientists in white coats watched from behind glass. A symbol would flash on a monitor in front of the creature, a simple circle, and an electrical jolt would make its hand twitch into a corresponding shape. It looked like a failed experiment in training an animal, a pathetic attempt to force intelligence where there was none. Maya leaned closer to the screen, her eyes narrowed in concentration. She pointed a finger at the video, her other hand signing to me. "They're not teaching it." Her movements were so fast I almost missed them. "It's trying to teach them." She rewound the footage, playing it in slow motion. Between the electrical shocks and the forced gestures, the creature's fingers would move in other ways, making subtle, complex shapes that the scientists were clearly missing. They were signs I had seen the creatures outside make, the ones I had dismissed as random spasms. She had found a key, a Rosetta Stone in this miserable little video from the world before. She had a baseline to begin a real translation. Garrett looked at me, his expression grim. "They're talking, and she can see it." On the tablet screen, the captured Murmur slowly turned its head, its pale eyes finding the camera lens. It stared directly at us from the past, and then the video feed dissolved into a screen of white static. The attack came 2 days later, not with a sound, but with a feeling, a sudden pressure against the fences of our world. I was on a patrol, walking the perimeter to check for weaknesses when I felt it, the distinct sensation of being watched by more than just a few stray creatures. I pulled out my own tablet, the one linked to our station's cameras, but the feed showed nothing, just the empty woods and the silent fence line. A message from Maya popped up on the screen, not words but a drawing, a frantic, crude sketch. It looked like a claw or a pincer, a symbol that meant nothing to me. I stopped, confused by the strange glyph, my focus on the screen instead of the path ahead. That moment of hesitation saved me. The woods erupted with silent movement as a dozen Murmurs burst from the trees, their trap sprung too early. They had been waiting for me to step into the narrow clearing just ahead. I scrambled backward, my rifle coming up as I fired 2 controlled shots, dropping the closest ones before I turned and ran. I glanced at my tablet as I sprinted back toward the station, hoping for some guidance, some direction. A new drawing appeared, a hastily drawn box with circles all around it. The box was the station. They were not just after me. They were already there. We locked ourselves in, the heavy metal doors of the station bolting shut with a solid finality. My entire philosophy of survival, of silent observation and controlled isolation, had shattered in an instant. The monitors showed them, dozens of them. not throwing themselves at the fences but testing them, pushing in unison, communicating with flicks of their wrists and turns of their heads. My arrogance was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp fear. I was no longer the interpreter, the one who understood the world. I was relying entirely on my daughter. Maya stood beside me, her eyes locked on the screens, her hands a blur as she translated their silent conversation. She told me they were coordinating, testing the tensile strength of the chain link, searching for a weak point. The strain was showing on her. A thin line of blood trickled from her nose, and she kept pressing the heel of her hand against her temple, as if to quiet a noise only she could hear. The siege went on for hours, a silent, grinding pressure. Then her hand stilled, her eyes wide with a new kind of horror as she watched the lead murmur. Her fingers trembled as she signed to me. They're not trying to get in anymore. They found something, a weak point. She made a sign I'd never seen before, a complex gesture she then simplified into a single, terrifying symbol, the sign for water. My blood went cold. I remembered the station's main water intake, a concrete pipe that fed our reservoir, a forgotten vulnerability far outside the fortified perimeter. The assault on the pipe began just as Garrett finally broke. He saw the focused attack on the monitor, and something inside him snapped. He confessed everything in a torrent of words. He was a bio-linguist on a corporate military contract called Project Chimera. They had created the fungus, not as a weapon, but as a communication tool, and they had tested it at a private prison called the Bastion. The Warden, a man named Silas Cole, had run the place. Garrett said their goal was to create a sonic frequency to control the creatures, to direct the Hive, but the project had backfired, and the plague escaped. He believed he could reverse the process, that his old lab at the Bastion held the key to creating a failsafe, a sound that would shatter their connection. As he was speaking, his voice choked with guilt. I was watching the monitor that showed the intake pipe. Maya stared at it beside me. The screen went black. The lights in the control room flickered once, then died, plunging us into absolute darkness. A deep, vibrating screech echoed up from the floor, traveling through the pipes and the walls right next to us. They were inside. We barricaded ourselves in the main server room, the only space with a reinforced steel door and no windows. The sounds of the station being torn apart filled the air, the screech of metal, the crash of equipment, a symphony of our failure. I watched Maya in the gloom, her face illuminated by the green glow of a single battery-powered monitor. She was pale, exhausted, a line of dried blood under her nose, but her eyes were still tracking the movement indicators on the screen, still doing her job. My control, my rules, my perfect, sterile cage had led us to this tomb. I had been wrong about everything. About safety, about her, about myself. The shame felt familiar, the same cold hollowness that had filled me on that diplomatic stage years ago when my pride had caused a crisis. I was about to speak, to tell her I was sorry, to finally cede all control to her, to trust her completely. Maya put a finger to my lips, her eyes wide with a terror that cut through my own. She did not look at me. She looked up. She pointed a trembling hand toward the ceiling, to the small metal ventilation grate set into the acoustic tiles. A long, pale finger was slowly, silently curling its way through one of the openings in the grate. My hand closed around a heavy fire extinguisher from its wall mount, and I moved without thinking. The old me would have frozen, would have calculated the risk and found it wanting, but the old me was dead in this room. I turned to Garrett and pointed to the main server rack, then to the emergency battery unit that powered it. He understood immediately, his haunted eyes widening with the desperate logic of the plan. He began pulling at the thick cables, exposing the raw copper terminals. Maya watched me, her expression unreadable in the dim light. I held the fire extinguisher ready, my knuckles white. There was no time for a long explanation, no time to sign my regret. There was only the act. Garrett gave a sharp nod, and I swung the heavy steel cylinder into the server rack. The sound was deafening, a catastrophic shriek of metal that made my teeth ache. Garrett jammed the live cables against the ruined chassis, and the room flooded with the ozone smell of frying electronics and a blinding blue flash. Alarms I did not know existed began to blare from the other side of the door, a frantic, loud noise that was a death sentence and our only hope. The finger in the grate above us vanished. I smashed the extinguisher against the door's lock mechanism until it buckled, and we spilled out into a corridor flashing with red emergency lights. The station was a cacophony of sirens and the sounds of destruction from deeper within. We had to move. I looked at Maya and signed quickly, my hands illuminated by the strobing lights. "We don't run. We go through. You lead." She looked back at me, her face pale but her eyes clear. She understood the weight of it, the trust I was placing in her. It was the apology I could not speak. She gave a single, firm nod. We ran for the service exit, the noise of the alarms covering our escape. Outside, the night was cold and absolute. The horde was in chaos, drawn to the blaring station. We slipped into the trees, a small island of silence in a world of frantic movement. Maya took the lead, her head tilted as if listening to something far away. Her hands began to move, quick, fluid gestures in the dark that I had the strain to see. She was our navigator, feeling the currents of the Hive mind. She guided us left around a thicket where a pack was gathering, then right through a shallow creek bed, her signs telling me of their positions, their intent. We were a single unit, moving through the enemy's world on their terms. We traveled for what felt like hours, a silent, tense journey through the woods. We were clear of the station, moving through the darkness with a growing sense of hope, when a brilliant white light sliced through the trees and pinned us in place. We froze like animals caught in a hunter's beam. A voice, amplified and metallic, echoed through the forest from a guard tower I could now see rising above the treetops. "Don't move. You are trespassers on the property of Warden Silas Cole." They brought us inside the walls, into a world of concrete and fluorescent lights. The Bastion was exactly as Garrett had described it, a fortress of brutalist order. Guards in clean uniforms marched us down sterile hallways to a central command room filled with video monitors. A large man stood with his back to us, watching the screens. He wore a warden's uniform, perfectly pressed, and he did not turn when we entered. "Report," he said, his voice a low growl of authority. "3 survivors, Warden. Found just outside the south perimeter. One of them is Vance." The man turned slowly. He was in his 50s, with short gray hair and a face that looked like it was carved from stone. His eyes passed over me with disinterest, then settled on Garrett with a flicker of recognition before finding Maya. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze analytical and cold. "I remember the project, Vance. The failures, the assets." His eyes remained on my daughter. "Leave us." The guards exited, the door shutting behind them with a heavy magnetic click. Silas walked toward us, his boots making sharp sounds on the polished floor. He stopped in front of Maya. "Your father kept you in a cage," Silas said, his voice surprisingly soft. "He wanted you to be silent. I can give you a voice that will shake the world." Maya stared back at him, her expression a mask of defiance. Before I could react, a red light began to flash on one of the consoles. Silas glanced at it, his face tightening with annoyance. On the perimeter monitors, silent shapes were massing at the walls. The Hive had followed us. Silas looked at the screens, then back at Maya, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "It seems they want you back." The attack began without a sound. On the monitors, we watched the Murmurs move with a terrifying precision that Silas's rigid defenses were not prepared for. They formed living ladders to scale the concrete walls, their movements coordinated by leaders who used hand signs. They exploited the blind spots between the guard towers, overwhelming the patrols with silent, disciplined force. Silas bellowed orders into a microphone, his voice echoing through the compound, but his men were falling, their brute force tactics useless against an enemy that fought like a silent army. The lights in the command room flickered as the prison's power grid began to fail. In the chaos, Garrett grabbed my arm. "The lab. Now." We ran. The corridors were a battleground. Guards fought desperately against the silent tide of creatures pouring into the prison. We raced past the fighting, following Garrett deeper into the facility. We rounded a corner and Silas was there, his face contorted with rage. He held Maya in front of him, a pistol pressed to her head. She is the key. She will restore my order. I saw it then, beyond Silas and my terrified daughter. A small group of Murmurs was moving down the intersecting hallway, their gestures sharp and tactical. I recognized the pincer formation from the attack on the station. They were preparing to flank us. I met Maya's eyes over Silas's shoulder. I signed with one hand, a quick, almost imperceptible gesture. Side, now. She understood. She threw her weight sideways, pulling Silas off balance for a single, crucial second. It was all the opening they needed. The Murmur kill team swarmed him, their pale hands pulling him down into a silent, writhing mass. We did not wait to watch him die. The lab was a clean, white room, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Garrett lunged for a large console beneath a broadcast dish mounted to the ceiling. He began typing furiously, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Screens came to life, filled with complex data streams. He activated the machine, and a low frequency filled the room, a vibration I felt in my bones. Garrett screamed, a raw, agonized sound, and collapsed to the floor, his body twitching as raw neurological feedback overloaded his brain. He was gone. I rushed to the console, and a warning message was flashing on the main screen in bright red letters. Broadcast uncalibrated. Latent sensitive neurofilter required. Connection could prove fatal. A compartment slid open on the console, revealing a headset covered in wires and electrodes. My blood ran cold. I looked at Maya. She had seen the message. She knew what it meant. My old fear, the terror of making a wrong interpretation, of causing a catastrophe, threatened to paralyze me. All my life I had tried to protect her by controlling her world, and now I had to make a choice that could destroy her mind. She looked at me, her face resolute. She stepped forward and pointed to the headset, then to herself. I shook my head, my hands trembling. She reached out and took my hands in hers, her grip surprisingly strong. She looked directly into my eyes, her own gaze unwavering. Trust me. I picked up the headset. My hands were steady now. I placed it gently on her head, the cold metal contacts pressing against her temples. I connected the final cable. Her eyes closed and her body went rigid. The data streams on the monitor began to surge, a chaotic storm of information. Her hands rose, her fingers spasming. Through the pain, she began to sign. The gestures were simple, strained. I adjusted a dial on the console, refining the frequency. Her whole body shuddered. Broader. I widened the signal's scope. A thin trickle of blood ran from her nose, just like at the station. Her breathing was shallow. Her fingers moved again, a desperate final command. Hold. I locked the settings. My entire life, my entire sense of self was tied to this single act of interpretation and trust. A high-frequency pulse, silent to my ears, washed out from the broadcast tower. On the monitors showing the prison yard, the effect was immediate. The Murmurs stopped. Their coordinated assault dissolved. Their tactical intelligence was gone, replaced by a single, overriding instinct. As one, the entire Hive turned. They began to shamble away from the prison, a great silent river of bodies moving west, away from us. We stood on the battlements of the fallen prison, the early morning light casting long shadows across the empty yard. The immediate threat was gone. The world was different now. I turned to Maya. "Are you okay?" I signed, my hands feeling heavy and slow. She looked out at the departing horde, her expression distant, clear but somehow altered. She turned to me, and her hands rose slowly. "They're gone, but I can still hear them." A whisper. We stood there together, father and daughter, equals looking out at the new, silent world. The cage was gone.